bringing the people behind our food to life.
My great-grandfather started farming the Olympia oyster here in Totten Inlet, just very close to this location around 1890. And he was very oriented at looking at opportunities, and knew that saw that these oysters, that there was an opportunity in the oysters, and so with family here and seeing the opportunities, he decided to go ahead and get involved with growing the Olympia oysters. And so sometime in the early 1890s, folks started experimenting with different ways to grow the oysters. They realized that they grew in tide pools, and so they started making basically an artificial tide pool. And as you can see on the beach here behind us, that it's terraced off, and essentially they're just large tidal pools. And that would insulate the Olympia oysters from the heat or the cold. And that was a very important breakthrough. And that was really the beginning of the farming industry of the native oyster here in South Puget Sound. The other thing that happened almost simultaneously was that the state determined that they would sell tidelands for oyster cultivation. And so that was a really important step. Folks would go through and put the investment into these diking systems. The bare land at the 1890s, early 1900s was selling for $1,000 an acre, which at that time was a lot of money. But then they would put all this investment into the diking, which was even more significant than the $1,000 an acre. And so being able to own that tidelands gave them the security that they could go ahead and start farming. The oyster market traditionally here on the West Coast were for shucked oysters. And when I started in 1980, almost all the oysters we harvested were shucked. And so we would go through, take the oysters in the shucking house and shuck them, and then they're put into jars and sold fresh in supermarkets or restaurants. We still do quite a bit of that, though it's only about 20% of our business at this time. Most of the rest of the oysters are sold as a single oyster. The majority of those are sold live, and they're sold at a variety of sizes, everything from a small oyster for a half shell bar for eating raw to great big large ones, 6-7 inches long. And then we actually freeze about 20% of the oysters we sell in the shell. And those will either take the top shell off, or we'll just leave it as a whole oyster and just freeze it with the shell on. In the late 20s, a pulp mill went into Shelton and almost immediately destroyed the industry here. The oysters, the native oysters, Olympias, died within just a year or two of the mill going in. At that time, there was no laws. They had no way to regulate. We realized after the pulp mills that water quality was really important to us. Without water quality, we didn't have an industry. And the pulp mill was an industrial source of pollution, and it actually killed the oysters and created just a lot of other problems besides killing the oysters. But so we were very focused. We understood what pollution did, and then the pulp mill actually went away in the late 1950s, and the bay started to clean up. But starting in the late 60s, you started to see the shorelines become developed. And we started having problems with human pollution. And so, and when that happens, we can't harvest those oysters in and around those areas because of the risk of people getting ill. And so ended up becoming very involved land use planning side of things, and also just working to protect the water quality. And so we recognized that you needed to be involved in the community, and so that they understood what what the problems were we were facing, and we need to voice our concerns and say, you know, you're going to put us out of business if you put this sewage treatment plant here, or if you don't have the appropriate septic system. So we got very involved beyond just the oyster farming because of the pollution. My brother and I and my sister, our children are now getting to the age where they're early to mid-20s, and so we're starting to work them into the family business here and have them participate. And so we're hoping that they will in turn become more involved and take over the business from us sometime in the next 20 or 30 years. We've got a lot of challenges, but we also think we have a bright future.
I show them how to do it, how do they grab the oyster, how they got to be careful when they open, because some they don't know how to open, and they don't have any idea.